Good morning and afternoon to some. Thank you for coming today and giving us your time. The agenda for today, we're taking a slightly different approach to the one that posted. Someone has their volume on. Could you turn on mute there? I'm hearing pages and so on. Thank you. So the agenda that was published treated AWP as a separate section, and in the philosophy of AWP, which is to create productivity at the workface, we've decided to incorporate the AWP commentary into the commentary with the contracting spectrum. So you're going to see it in that format for the next hour and a half, which with the breaks that are already scheduled, and so that'll be the approach that we take with the agenda that we have right now. Thank you kindly. If you could advance the slide, Stephen. So we heard a little bit about the benefits or the reasons or the rationale for having a contracting strategy, and so we wanted to point out, or for those of you who are a little bit new to the topic of contract strategy, we want to talk a little bit about why you should put in the effort and why it's a good idea. If you could advance the slide, Stephen. So this is what often happens in a work context. Typically, and this can be the same for collaborative methods as well, typically things that require upfront effort, like developing a strategy or developing a collaborative relationship, for example, the things that take time at the front end, at the beginning, can sometimes feel like perhaps we're too busy. We can't do this. We're running. We don't have time to stop and think and take some kind of a sort of a best practice type of approach. And so the idea here is that today we're going to talk about why it's a good idea to in this case take the wheel and have a strategic approach to contracting. Go ahead, Stephen. Next slide, please. So I always like to take this from the point of view of what's in it for me, and my colleagues presenting here today have that same point of view. With a strategy, with a contracting strategy, it's just a much better way of approaching your contracting behaviors and activities and opportunities. With a strategy, you can be a source of power and a source of certainty for the people around you. You can be a skilled craftsperson, and you can craft a strategy. You take a contracting approach that's well thought out, and with that, you can lead. Whether you're a leader of a team or you're leading in a particular project or contracting effort, this is a way to sort of take charge of a situation and lead with intelligence. Now, there's some personal satisfaction from doing things well, and having a strategy, having a plan, and having a path to success is it's good. It feels good because you've got a plan in a complex world where things are always changing, including, for example, market conditions, or you have multiple stakeholders that are trying to understand what is going on from a contracting perspective. You can have personal success and also bring the project to project success by applying these best practices, and because you're the guy with the plan, or the girl with the plan. You're the person who's going to take them through the chaos and to the ideal result. And so that's what's in it for you. For having a strategy. This is one of the reasons why, or these are the reasons why, to put the time and effort into it. Go ahead, Stephen. and one more, of course. So some of it is that we're going to be answering today. Another type of question that we'll be answering today is just what is a contracting strategy? You know, we have our version of it, and it can differ, frankly, in my experience, from industry to industry. And we will explore what it means for the construction industry today. If you could advance the slide, Stephen. Okay, so one of the first things that we wanted to emphasize here is that a contract strategies is actually, it's a document, it's a documented deliverable. Like it's something that is, sometimes some organizations will have a template for this, but it is something that you create that explains in writing what the contracting strategy is. It's not just a conversation, and it's not just a whiteboard sketch in a meeting room that's not written down. Like you could get consensus in a meeting room, for example, on a particular strategic approach to contracting, but it's not really anything that's documented or auditable or whatever. So the idea behind the contracting strategy is it is a documented deliverable, and it should be able to be read by everybody. In this case, in the project and projectized context, should be able to be read by anybody in that particular context, and them understand what a contract strategy is and what the contract strategy is for this particular project or even a program, if you're going to do it at the program level. Now, that document is best generated by a multidisciplinary team. And when I say that, I mean from people who represent all the different phases of a construction project. So it would be very good to have someone with the design perspective, someone from construction with a construction perspective, certainly you know, other inputs like safety and quality, if these are important components of the strategy, they're important contributors. Maybe technology, maybe systems, and then also people from functional groups. You know, maybe finance has an interest, procurement as a separate function from contracting, if it exists in your organization as a separate discipline, has an interest, and all of these people, depending on the project, should be involved in some way in developing the strategy, and should generally have something in the nature of a consensus. The idea here is that with this consensus, you will tend to have a collective will to move forward with the strategy, where you have some people, you don't want a situation where you have some people advancing the strategies and other essentially holding it back or not participating. The strategy itself should outline the various options that you have from a contracting perspective, evaluate them, you know, generally in a comparative way against each other, and then allow or demonstrate the best choice amongst those options. And each of those options should give you a path to an ideal future state for the contract, but the idea is that the strategy should help you select the best of those options. So again, to summarize, documented deliverable done with a multidisciplinary team, a choice amongst various contracting options, and the one that's best for the project. Those are the four key components of what a contract strategy is. If you could advance the slide. Okay, so I mentioned a multidisciplinary team. So here's an example of something from my practice of a who might attend one of these sessions, and what the agenda might be. And so this is this is a little bit of a work tool for those of you who this is new to, which I've used. And the idea here is that you have some people that should be there, sort of like a core team that should potentially come to all the meetings about the contracting strategy, or all of whom have what I would call sort of a strong review right or an edit right. And then there's a number of other stakeholders, and that's entirely dependent on the project situation or project context, who could be merely observers or readers, or acceptors, and or they could have some kind of edit. So the idea here is that you have this group, this core group that puts it together, and then probably a larger group that might review it and hopefully follow it. And so you would typically do this as a meeting. I mean, in the old days we used to do this in person, but now you're looking more at a virtual meeting. And the idea here is that you would run it with some sort of context, and you know, we're here to develop a contract strategy. This is how we're going to go about doing it. And then you, as the leader, as the contract strategist, let's call you, would then run the meeting with a view, or series of meetings with a view to getting through to the creation of a contract strategy. If you could advance the slide, Stephen. Okay, so when should a contract strategy be developed? So the best answer is early. Okay, if you could advance the slide, Stephen. So here's a number of perspectives about, you know, when you should start it. And the diagram on the top left, this is sort of a typical project management, industrial project management type of physiology, with this reference to the FEL, or front-end loading. And there are two front-end loading phases, oftentimes one where you're sort of at a high level for FEL2, and then when you get into a more detailed design around FEL3. And then sort of it's in this FEL2 area, if assuming you can attract the attention of the various participants, this is when you should be starting your contracting strategy. And it's typically, you know, as soon as you know enough about the project to understand, so you're sort of at this definition stage. As soon as you know enough about the project that you can start to create a contract strategy, because in some cases it's just too early, then this is when you start your strategy development. And please keep in mind, this can be done potentially even before the project is funded, because sometimes the money comes later. So sometimes you can get started in planning before, you know, the approval to spend actually arrives. Because you know, sometimes with the governance, it actually ends up, the project actually starts before the money arrives. If you're in a situation like that, so that's actually one of the reasons why people don't engage in strategy. Just say, oh, we don't have the money yet. There's no point in doing any planning. But sometimes then, and the money arrives, and everybody just sort of bursts out the gate and starts running to the end of the job right away. You can have a problem where you'll advance, but you will do it without a strategy. So the idea is, as soon as you have enough, and we'll talk about what enough is, but as soon as you have enough to know about the project from a definition perspective, this is where you start doing your contract strategy. Now, in a non-construction or industrial context, on the right-hand side, this is sort of your standard PMI, Project Management Institute. There's various phases. There's the initiating processes, and then there's the planning processes. So this should be done in the planning processes. If you're going to look at it from a PMI perspective, and you're looking for which phase in the PMI methodology should be starting with this contracting strategy effort, Richard, it's in the planning phases. And then on the bottom left-hand side is a typical contracting life cycle. And one of the key things here is you'll see this, you know, you get this request. This is sort of, you know, from the bowels of the contracting organization. You'll get a request, and oftentimes the first step then, if you're not behaving in a fully strategic way, is to start to reach for a template. And so you want to develop the strategy before you do that. The template actually shouldn't really even necessarily be part of the strategy discussion, because generally speaking, templates will presuppose a number of strategic choices that you would in fact not be choosing anymore because you're using a particular template. So before you get to the authoring portion, which usually starts with a template of some sort, that's when you do the strategy. So For those of you who are engaged in contracting activity and then your first step is template, my suggestion, respectfully, is to back up a bit and start with the strategy work before you choose a template. Because the template will usually choose for you some kind of project delivery model or compensation or remuneration model right away. So if you have made a choice of template, then you've effectively made those strategic choices in a more rote way. And then lastly, on the bottom right-hand side, from a supply chain perspective, some of the feedback some people might give is, well, we can't really do a strategy. This is just a commodity acquisition or something like that. So, and that's quite right. So you see here on the right-hand side, something called the Kraljic matrix, which is a typical decisioning matrix for how you treat a particular product or the supplier who makes that product by extension, that's used in the supply chain context. And the idea is that only in situations where the partner is more of a strategic acquisition are you using a strategy. So you're not going to use a strategy necessarily, or strategic effort. You're not going to invest strategic effort in commodity type acquisitions typically. And so you really need to make a choice as to what the appropriate context is for when you're doing this, from not just from a project perspective or a contracting lifecycle perspective, but from a what am I buying perspective. Is the relationship I'm looking to have with these suppliers going to be strategic? Is there a benefit to having a strategic relationship? If so, then, well, for ideal, then start with the contracting strategy effort. So thank you. Go ahead, Stephen. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to get into the how, and there's some great ways. So that's sort of what we were built at today. There's some great ways to go about building a strategy, and in that case, I'd like Stephen to advance the slide, and then I'll bring on one of my esteemed colleagues here, Keith Critzer, to talk about. To start to talk about the how. So go ahead, Stephen, if you could advance the slide. Okay, so Keith, are you on?
Yes, I'm on.
You're having better luck than I am with the tool?
I would say no. My video is not working, but fortunately you can hear me. Really quick with the moderator, we're at 9 o'clock. We started a little late. Would you like to keep the break, or would you like to continue with the presentation?
So that'll be a question for Robert. Robert, you are muted, just a reminder.
There we go. If you want to go 15 more minutes and then take the break, if that makes any sense, and then we'll go from 9:15 to 9:30 for a break, just a little shorter, and we'll be back on track.
Very good. Okay, so I'm going to go over the how. How do you do your contracting strategy? So this diagram shows a very high level approach to it. As you can see on the left with the inputs, really like to start at the bottom on the internal capability and complexity. And really what that has to do with is what is your company going to do itself? So for example, at ExxonMobil, in the downstream, we have some self capability where we can do process design and we can do some aspects of front end loading in-house versus going out to the external marketplace to do that. In other parts of the business, we have to go out to the marketplace to get information or input from third-party providers or contractors. Depending on our business area, currently our structure is we have a matrix organization. So we have a global projects company that does projects for the upstream, downstream, and chemicals. So we have a pretty significant, sophisticated capability to do project management in-house, but we still have to work with our business partners to really define the project opportunities. So that can get pretty complicated. We also have some research arms that do, research in different processes or technology. So if we're doing a new type of product line, for example, in our chemical business, then we might have to interface with the chemical company. So that would be an example of internal capability and complexity. On the external market assessment, really what we're looking at there is, despite our view that we build our projects, we don't really build our projects. Our contractors build our projects. So it's important to know, depending on where we're building the new facility and where we're putting the asset, what's available to do that, and who or which firms are available and what's their situation. And it has to do with both industry perspective and also overall economy perspective. As an example, as we've all just been through the pandemic, that resulted in some, slowness or pausing in some of our industrial activity. And as a result, some of our projects were paused through that period, and then some of them will be restarting. Others that were planning on going to appropriation throughout industry may have been paused and may be restarting. So if you look at the external environment, we could have reduced capacity in the industry to support projects, and we could have some pent-up demand as projects that we're planning on going forward over the last year and a half are maybe resumed or restarted. So you really need to look at the external environment and understand what's the state of the supply chain or the contractors that you're going to use. And also depending on where you're building it. So we build our facilities often near where the resources lie. And some of those locations could be less developed than others, like pioneer locations. And as a result, there could be a lack of infrastructure that we may need to build as part of the project scope. So you need to look at all of that when you're considering your contracting strategy. The next with the arrow and the capability, really what that has to do with is how sophisticated or how involved is your company in putting together the strategy. So if you have a smaller projects organization, maybe you bring in a consultant or maybe you bring in some outside help. You could have some constraints, whether it's your corporate policies, thou shalt use procurement and thou shalt do competitively bid lump sum in all cases. Could be government requirements depending on where you're operating, or local laws. So there could be some constraints on the capability. And then as you move over to the outputs, it's really the how. Like, so the contracting strategy will show some examples of what it looks like and the components of it. WBS means work breakdown structure. So what would be the chunks of work that the different contractors would be doing for you? How would you allocate risk, whether it's cost, schedule, performance, hazard risk, what kind of compensation model? And then the contractual arrangements are really around what kind of agreements are you going to use and who's going to actually do the work. So let's move to the next slide, please. So this is a flow chart of the major steps in the contracting process. I'd like to emphasize that it's really important to focus on what we call the 4 R's in ExxonMobil. So that's the right contracting strategy, the right contract, the right contractors, and the right project team. So this really shows that depiction. So on the left, you have what we call the contracting quilt, and myself and my colleagues will get into more details around that. But the colorful boxes really depict the different contracts and the scopes. So once you come up with the quilt, you move into compensation. So the 4 primaries are lump sum, unit price, unit rate, and reimbursable costs are kind of the 4 primaries that we use. But there's other ones like GMAX and pay and gain sharing and incentive contracting and some other things. Then you move into risk distribution. A lot of that might follow the compensation selection, but it could also be around risk of loss or performance risk. And then the schedule is very important in that how are the different contracts need to fit together to support the overarching contracting schedule. It's also important in your contractor selection process in that if you want to do a competitive tendering process, it could take longer in the schedule to accommodate the project, the bid cycle. So you need to understand that in order to get into selection. So selection means, are you going to bid it? Are you going to negotiate it? Are you going to use an alliance? How are you going to pick the contractor that's going to do the work? And then you move into organizational planning, and this is really the right project team. So really it's from the owner's perspective. Ideally, the owner forms its team based on the contractor's team, meaning that the whole cohesive team will perform well together. Oftentimes we form the owner's team, and then the owner's team picks the contractor, and instead of having a team that is stronger together, you often have a team that may not be overall stronger. So it's very important to look at what's the contractor's strengths and weaknesses, and can I compensate that with my owner team, and what's my owner team's strengths and weaknesses, and can I complement that with my contractor team. And then you go through the contracting process, you sign the contract, and then that feeds into the project plan, which will fit with other activities that you're doing. So it could be estimating and funding, it could be commissioning a startup, it could be getting permits. So the contracting piece of it fits into the overarching project plan. All right, can we go to the next slide, please? So this really shows that there's a lot of things that go into your contracting strategy. And I really just want to highlight a couple of the items, but for your company, it could be different depending on where you are in the supply chain. But on the top left, the business objectives arrow, that's really the big driver. So what am I trying to achieve with this project, and what is my execution plan to deliver the project, and how does the contracting plan support that? So for example, in ExxonMobil, depending on what business we're in, whether it's chemicals, refining, fuels and lubricants, upstream oil and gas, some of them have different drivers. So as an example, the chemical company, we do both commodity chemicals or basic chemicals, and we also do specialty chemicals. So with some of the specialty chemicals, there could be a driver where we want to get to the market first, whereas with, say, basic chemicals, we could just want lowest cost of supply, right? So that we can maximize our margin when we're selling our product versus a competitor's commodity product. So depending on those drivers, that will definitely impact your contracting strategy in the form of whether it's cost, schedule, quality. What are my drivers there? Generally with ExxonMobil, safety and quality are the first two. And then after that, it's really around cost or schedule. Moving on to execution planning. So the execution planning piece really should be done before the contracting. And so you really need to figure out, how am I going to execute this project? How am I going to deliver all the different pieces? And then once you figure that out, then you kind of shape your contracting strategy. So there's some important things, like, for example, are you going to do module fabrication strategy? Or are you going to do a stick-built construction strategy? Those are kind of some big choices you pick. So those types of decisions need to be made early before you go into your contracting planning process. Then finally, on the lessons learned piece, so, you know, I've done these types of projects before. What did I learn on those last time? Can I bake that into my strategy to make sure that I don't relearn lessons, and that the full knowledge of the company is brought to bear to deliver the most efficient project. Moving on to the right side, local factors could be really important. So in our business, we often have a focus on local content. So if we're partnering with a resource owner, oftentimes the resource owner wants the projects to benefit their people, so they want us to maximize local content so that the project dollars go to the population. Even in countries like the US, we often have a tax abatement agreement with the local government where the amount of tax abatement we get is dependent on how many jobs are created as a result of the project and the new asset. So we have targets there as well, and that will drive your strategy in that maybe you might have smaller work packs so that local companies can handle it versus the big multinational ones. Market intelligence and long lead equipment. So LLE is long lead equipment. Often the long lead equipment will drive your schedule and when you need to buy certain things and when you need funding. Finally, the market conditions is a really big one. So depending on the type of market, if it's a heated market or a cold market, that might determine your strategy. So oftentimes in heated markets, when it's difficult to predict the cost of materials, equipment, and the availability of labor, oftentimes you may select maybe a reimbursable cost compensation model or an alliance model versus, say, a lump sum model where you could have a lot of contingency money or a lack of interest from the marketplace. So that was it for that section. So we can go into the
Welcome back, everyone. And we're going into our next 1 hour segment. We do have another segment that we'll start. We'll take another break at the end of this 1 hour segment. And then we'll have another segment between 11 and noon. We'll take questions for our group in that segment just before lunch. I'll turn this back over to Richard. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a nice break and were able to get the requisite coffee. So what the agenda promised and what we're going to be looking at, more or less from here on in, is this idea of a contracting spectrum. The reason why we're using a spectrum is that it's a great way to show your variety of choices. I mentioned earlier in a contract strategy or part of a contract strategy, or what it is this choice that you would make amongst available contracting models. And they vary greatly by industry, and we'll be focusing on construction industry, and we're trying to tailor some of our conversation around the attendees that are showing up today in terms of the industry they've come from. So you'll see that here. Stephen, if you could advance the slide, please. Okay, great. So we've set this up, the way we've set this up today, for this specific topic, because we're going to be going from traditional to collaborative in our approach, in our discussion, and in fact, that's how we're going to progress from an ordering perspective today. Is that we started on the left-hand side where you see, really the spectrum is about collaboration and shared risk. So on the left-hand side is what we would call, or the traditional contracting choices, which is what myself, Keith, and Paul are focusing on primarily in this first bit in our presentation today. And then going right to the other end of the spectrum, where you're dealing with alliances. PPA as a project alliance. NEC3 is a type of collaborative contract that's used a lot in the UK, and then IPD, integrated project delivery. You're going to see some presentations on that, and I think at least one person's mentioned that terminology so far. So those are the more collaborative methods on the right-hand side, and you'll hear more of those in the latter part of today, and then mostly on day two. So that's how we set up our spectrum. So at the top part of the spectrum, you'll see what I would call the corollary procurement type activity on the to the contracting choices that you have across the bottom. And right in the middle, you'll see design build, EP plus C, EPC, and EPCM, and that's a lot where we're going to focus our attention today. But we did want to tip our hat to sort of that civil and industrial or civil and infrastructure attendees, where we view design build as kind of similar to EPC. So in industrial, it might be referred to as EPC, and in other sectors, non-industrial sectors, it might be referred to as design build or versions design build. So you have your, on the left-hand side, you have your traditional design bid build, which might be relevant to some of the folks in the public sector. And in fact, it's oftentimes mandated. I think Keith mentioned something, thou shalt or you shalt use a particular method. So the most traditional method really is doing tendering, which is oftentimes governed by regulatory or trade agreements, and it really requires sort of the lowest compliant bid being accepted. Sometimes it's referred to as 3 bids and a buy, and basically price is your major determinant. A typical approach would be to use this lump sum compensation model and a design bid build. And then you'll see these reference here. These are Canadian references with CCDC's, the Canadian Construction Documents Committee 2. So it's a standard form design bid build contract, and or FIDIC Red Book. And there's a number of other forms that are out there that operationalize essentially or templatize this design bid build type of approach. But we're really focusing on that this is very much a price-based decision, and oftentimes the procurement method is let's call it highly transactional. And then moving over as we move in the direction of more shared risk or a higher level of collaboration, we have CM, which is construction management, and that can be done agency or at risk. In one case, it basically just who holds the risk is allocated differently. So the construction management at risk, the construction manager tends to take more of the risk, and in the other case, the owner holds those risks, that package of risks. And then the GMP is the guaranteed maximum price, which is a terminology that's used in a few jurisdictions. I'm thinking about the UK primarily. So that's another model that's a little bit more, let's call it a little bit more of a sharing of risk within the context of the owner versus contractor relationship. And then FEED is the front-end engineering design. For those of you in the industrial sector will know that. Open book, which means that oftentimes the pricing is exposed, and how much it's exposed is really a function of the relationship in my view, but oftentimes you can get into showing margins. And then you have your design bid build, EPC, EP plus C, EPC and EPCM. Lots of acronyms, and Paul's going to get into those in larger detail, so I don't really want to repeat that. In these areas, you will tend to get what I call multi-factor selections, which means that you're not just selecting on price, it's price and that may or may not be a terribly sophisticated form of procurement, but basically it's the difference between a tender and what I would typically call an RFP or request for proposal. And in some cases, you may engage in some kind of pre-qualification effort in advance of that, and then you're sending the proposal to a pre-selected set of suppliers that are either on the shelf or they're selected through the actual procurement process in the case when they're not already on the shelf. And then lastly, we're starting to get into the hybrids, which is combinations of the prior models, the earlier position models on this spectrum. PMC is performance management. FEED again, open book plus PC, and then the interesting one here is convertible, where you have your compensation model actually changes through the project, oftentimes from lump sum to reimbursable as you begin to know more about the project as the project progresses. Then you might, or sorry, the other way around. It changes from reimbursable to lump sum because the more you know, the more you're able to properly estimate, or contractors are probably able to properly estimate a lump sum. So as certainty increases, the more accurate a lump sum price can be. So again, I misspoke earlier. So it's converting from reimbursable or unit rate over to lump sum. And in these cases, with some of these relationships, you may engage in a more sophisticated forms of procurement, where called category management, where basically you take all of your spend, divide it up into categories, and have management strategies for each category of spend. And then on the far right-hand side, with your more collaborative contracts which again, I won't get into detail. I don't want to steal anybody's thunder for anybody who's coming after me. But the idea here is that you're less about engaged in procurement activity and more around supplier relationship management. So oftentimes this type of work is done with suppliers that are already in existence, or relationships that potentially have been around for quite a long time, and you're not necessarily going to use any kind of bidding activity here. You might engage in some strategic procurement in terms of adjustment of the relationship from a performance management perspective or a relationship management perspective, but sometimes you can you do sole source type work here, or it's sole source for a particular category of spend or for a particular component of the project, where you're just giving it to one party that you've known for a long time because you trust them and that there's a strong relationship. So that's sort of the progression here. And so there's a variety of choices. There's a heck of a lot of complexity in here, actually. And so now we're going to delve more into that, with Paul focusing very much on that EPC, EPCM, EPNC, and PMC. So go ahead, Paul. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Just a quick sound check. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Thanks. Now, I should also ask, can you understand me? Because I have a bit of a Scottish accent, but hopefully everything's clear. And thanks everyone for the opportunity to have a good discussion on this topic. Richard, I think, elaborated very well there on the spectrum, and my experience is in the oil and gas and petrochemical industry, so I will lean a little bit on this, but I will try and kind of reference the kind of constructs that have maybe the same form but a different terminology for other industries as I go through. But here you'll see in a little bit more detail some of the items that Richard mentioned in the previous slide on the spectrum. So I'll just talk you through those in a little bit more detail. So EPC in our terminology in oil and gas industry means engineering, procurement, and construction. Is where all the activity is with one head contractor or main contracting party who manage the engineering, purchase all the equipment, and then with the engineered design and the purchased equipment and materials, they then build the final facility or plant or whatever. And that's all under one overall sort of turnkey contractor. So the red line, and actually in all the diagrams, references the direct contractual relationship. So you'll see here in the EPC that the direct contractual relationship is between the company and the EPC contractor. The EPC contractor may do things directly, but may also then subcontract. So most obviously they would subcontract to the supplier of equipment and materials, and typically that's done on a fixed price or against some kind of long-term call-off agreement. And then they would also procure the construction contractors or the installation contractors. Could also be, in the case of a modular design, a fabrication contractor. Also, not that common, but possible that they could subcontract some of the engineering. This may be in specialist areas like technical and process safety, or detailed structural calculations or stress analysis. And this would, this is an area that's kind of more aligned to, so we say, the owner's engineer, and in some cases they may bring in an extra party. So the EPC could be a company that is more construction dominated than engineering dominated, and therefore they either buy the services of an engineering contractor, or they go into consortium. So certainly in oil and gas industry, with the size of contract values, it's not uncommon for EPCs that are done on a lump sum basis to involve a consortium of partners who share this risk. So I'm focusing here on structure. I'll talk about compensation models in the next couple of slides, but these are kind of like the structure or the delivery model of the contract form. So that's EPC. EPCM is a little bit different in that the contractual relationships are with the company and the suppliers and the construction or fabrication or installation or implementation contractors. So the contractual relationship and the risk exposure of compliance to contract is formally and legally with the owner company, whereas in the EPC, that's formally with the EPC contractor. Now, what the EPCM contractor in this model is intended to do is to manage those contractual relationships for and on behalf of the company. Yeah, so they are basically the advisor or the owner's engineer who is both supervising the engineering but also the project management of the activity. But any variations, any changes to scope, etc., all have to be communicated via the contractual line between the company and the supplier or the implementation contractor. The individual contracts between the supplier and the implementation contractor can take multiple remuneration forms, but typically the EPCM contract is reimbursable, maybe on a cost plus type arrangement or a cost plus incentive fee. And in the early alliance contracts, this was also done with what's known as a target incentivized cost, where you set a target and then you share in the underruns, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So these are ones where there's kind of one overall integration, whether it's under a head contract in EPC or via an EPCM. For the EP plus C contract, that's where, also known as the split form contract, the EP or the engineering and procurement is done by one company, so they design and buy the equipment, and then you have a construction contractor who will take that design and that equipment and install it as per the design. Yeah, and in both cases, that is a direct contract with the company. Again, the remuneration models can vary here. So although it says here kind of reimbursable for EP and unit rate for construction, they could equally be a lump sum arrangement for both of those, depending on the context. I think here, one of the key benefits of this approach is that, generally speaking, the engineering and procurement is finalised and available prior to the construction contractor starting. There is evidence that suggests in the other forms, the EPC and EPCM, sometimes construction runs away and then not everything is lined up. And I think that's a very key aspect of advanced work packaging that Keith will talk about later, is making sure that the engineering and all the equipment is ready and available and matches the path of construction. And in this form, there's a little bit more of a contractual distinction that really allows that to be driven well. It does have a challenge that there's an interface to be managed, and in this form you see the company manages that interface, and there are some hybrid approaches where the company can seek support from an EPCM or Pmc type contractor who doesn't have any contractual accountabilities but provides advice and guidance. And again, that would be similar to a kind of owner's engineer. If you compare it to infrastructure or government type approaches, then the EPC is more like the design and build, and the the design bid and build, and the EP plus C is more like a design and build. Yeah, so with that distinction between, shall we say, the designer and the constructor. And lastly, the PMC approach is one that we tend to describe in the oil and gas industry when we have a mega project, where we have multiple large scopes which all have to come together. Usually in our industry, it would typically be a large multi-billion-dollar development with multiple process units or plants. Most typically in refinery or petrochemical projects where they have lots of different types of processes, mainly involving licensed technology, which may come from many different partners. And within that, you may have different constructs. So you have some of the scope is done as an EPC, some is done as an EPCM, and then you would like support for one overarching owner's engineer type equivalent or project management contractor who will provide management oversight on behalf of the company, usually because company doesn't have sufficient resources available to manage the breadth of the scope, so they seek support. You may also hear that nowadays called more of an integrated project management team. They're quite similar in their approaches. PMC is typically an approach where there's a kind of definition to the deliverables and the scope, and IPMT is a little bit more of a blended team approach, but they have similar intent, which is to have a joint team between company and a consultant or an advisor who will then oversee the other contracts. So yeah, that's just trying to give a little bit of an explanation of the models that we apply. And as I said, I mentioned on design, bid and build. I'm not going to go into too much detail regarding the more collaborative aspects or constructs. That I'll speak a little bit later about the case for collaboration. And then Michael DeBril tomorrow will go into a lot more detail on some of the collaborative constructs. So this is very much setting the scene on, shall we say, the traditional approaches and contract forms. Next slide, please, Stephen. So here I'm just trying to polarize a bit the compensation model. So how do we pay? And obviously we touched on it in the last slide, but that was mainly on structures. But if you think there are kind of there's two bookends, as I would call it. There's cost plus, which is where you pay for kind of every hour spent, every piece of equipment at cost with a markup or a margin for services to buy the equipment. The other bookend is fixed price. So you've asked the company to give you a one-off price to build the whole scope. And you're not just paying for whatever they pay with a margin or a markup. It's actually for them to manage the overall total cost. And then performance-based, which leads towards the collaborative or incentivized arrangements, which seeks to drive and align all the parties. And I won't dwell too much on that, as I said, because there'll be more on that in the rest of the summit. But if you look just at the key elements of the contract, for cost plus and fixed price, generally there will be a high level of contractual detail, both in the scope as well as the terms and conditions. Performance-based relies a lot more on supplier relationships and maybe a repeat engagements over multiple projects or scopes where you've built a trusted relationship. Therefore, you can rely on less detail because you're confident that you can work together. I've already mentioned a little bit on the payment schemes, but the performance base, really looking at either output or outcome based performance, so that both parties get rewarded if the right performance is met. So do we meet or beat the cost? Do we have a faster schedule? Is the quality and the production attainment high? And basically, is the outcome at least what was required? And if better, do all parties share in some of the improvements and the economic benefits that brings? On cost plus, it's very easy to draw up the contract, because you essentially let the engineering company run ahead, and you can modify and adapt as you go, because you just pay for the hours or the items that are consumed, and it's in that respect very straightforward to assess and price. But the provider, i.e. the supplier or the contractor, isn't really exposed to any unexpected costs. So any change in scope, any change in external market pricing, any delays that mean you have to pay more for an establishment at the construction site, those are all at the risk of the company or the owner. Fixed price, it's the opposite. The buyer or the company or the owner doesn't pay unexpected costs. Those are at the risk of the supplier, so the EPC or the design, bid and build. And then the last one on performance based is really it drives goal alignment. So the last row talks about goal alignment, and what you'll see is the cost plus and fixed price. There's a view that those are not the best at driving alignment, whereas the performance-based or collaborative contract is seeking to be very driven by an understanding of what both parties want to get out of the relationship, what success looks like, and how they can both share and win in that success. And it really looks to get the best of the insights and the experience of all the parties. To look at the disadvantages of each of these, the cost plus, doesn't really look at what the buyer's doing. It does require a lot of administration support, because usually involves some kind of remeasuring of scope or activity. It's also quite difficult to tie, so we say, man hours that are expended to produce deliverables or produce scope, and it can limit the incentive on the supplier to actually reduce or control costs, because they will get reimbursed for everything they spend, and that can lead to that misalignment of goals. The fixed price does limit the amount of changes. So if you have an uncertain scope, then this is not necessarily the best approach, and it does require a good understanding of all the supplier base, as well as the risks that could apply to the scope, to allow the supplier to be able to provide a competitive cost for the scope that's defined, that also they believe that they can actually meet or beat, so that they make money and don't come back with claims or variations. But it is inherently less flexible to managing changes or new requests. But one of the big challenges in this approach is it drives an adversarial relationship where parties that are supplying look for claims to increase the price against which they have to deliver, in order that they can make potentially more profit. And the company party tends to resist this, so it tends to look at who bears risk and how do we mitigate it, versus how do we work together, and that's what the performance-based approach seeks to do. So I think, in summary, in cost plus, the owner or the buyer bears most of the risk. In fixed price, the supplier tends to bear most of the risk. And in performance-based, we look to have a transparent and mature discussion around what are the risks, who's best to bear it, and how do we drive mutual performance for both parties, that everybody can make a fair, or in some cases, better than average profit margin from a successful outcome. Move to the next slide, please, Stephen. So this just shows it shows kind of the spectrum of the compensation or contract structure against the amount of scope efforts required and the risk to the company. So these are all various types of remuneration mechanism. And what you'll see is there are some that require much more detail on scope, so it's very well defined, so it's easy to estimate and also to assess and minimize the risk. And in theory should then have a reduced financial risk to the company. If you go to the other end of the spectrum, a day rate or time and materials contract is one where you basically pay for the cost of a person, or the pricing of materials from a stockist that is fixed and readily available in the market, and you just use them as you need. And if you're not efficient, you don't have engineering available or items of procured materials, you still pay for that person to be available. You're clear on what you pay for the individual, but the efficiency and the productivity of that individual is more challenged, and therefore can lead to a significantly increased financial risk because you spend money with limited output. And I guess the spectrum it changes in between. So, I think we've already elaborated the lump sum, which is for a full scope. A bill of quantities is where you have a pricing for the elements that make up the scope. So it's obviously many lump sums, as it were. A schedule of norms is where you define the amount of time or effort to do a specific activity. So it could be the hours to produce an engineering drawing, the hours to manufacture a piping isometric, the hours to pour a concrete foundation, and then you would then have a fixed rate for the labour or the manpower that would do that activity against the number of hours. And you typically then would have a good definition of the cost per activity, but you may not know the number of activities or the number of quantities. The unit rate looks to combine both the norm and the manpower rate or the labour rate, and says you will basically pay for a given deliverable at a unit. So I won't say how many hours or what the cost of the labour is, but I'll say that in order to pour a foundation of X meters cubed, the cost will be Y dollars. In order to deliver an engineered drawing or a purchase requisition for a given type of equipment, the cost will be Y dollars. Yeah. And then you move into the more, the less defined areas where you pay more for the activities and or the items. And as you move away from time and materials and day rate towards reimbursable cost or cost plus with a fee, you try to drive the reimbursable behaviour with some kind of control and incentive. So the incentive is saying, I'll put a KPI on this, and if you meet the KPI, then I will give you an additional bonus or additional monies. And what that means is, for example, if you say I want a cost KPI or a schedule KPI, if they stay within the cost, they get their profit that's embedded in the rates, but then they'll get an additional profit from the incentive earned from the KPI. An alternative method is on cost plus incentive fee, is that you ask a supplier to kind of assess the total hours or the total estimate, and then say, of that estimate, this much is your fee or your profit. And that element is fixed. Yeah, so you will then say, if you deliver 1,000 hours of work and the profit is 10%, so you say nominally you get 100 as profit. If you then reduce the 1,000 hours to say 800 to do the same activity, but you still would get the fee of 100. So instead of being 100 over 1,000, 10%, it becomes 100 over 800, and that increases to 12 or 13%. So you've increased your profit margin. So again, it tries to drive the behaviours in a way that it's aligning with the owner. So the next couple of slides are detailed summaries of the advantages and disadvantages of each of these items. I'm not going to talk through those in detail. I have already, I think, elaborated quite well, but we'll make sure that these are available, in the information that's shared after the summit. And of course, if there's any questions on these items in the Q&A session, we can come back and elaborate this. But I think if you take it to its highest level, it's really looking at who takes risk, what level of definition do you have, how does that align with your project objectives, and how do you ensure that both parties are working together in order to achieve an outcome that they are happy with. And one of the things we'll explore in the collaborative approach is that may be a more optimal approach to align the interests. And I think that's key. It's not to say you can't do it with the other approaches, and we will talk a little bit about that later, about the tips or the tactics that allow you to make the best of any of the models. Because I think, as Richard elaborated, it is sometimes required in public procurement rules or by key stakeholders if you're working on a global basis with other governments or major stakeholders. They do require, for example, a lump sum EPC type construction, very common in parts of the world when you're looking for project finance from banks, etc. So I think it's important to understand the pros and cons of each of these approaches, and then assess it against the risk, the market, contractor and supplier availability, and the outcomes you're looking to achieve to make that final selection. So I think I'll leave it there, and I think Keith's going to pick up in the next section indeed around how you might make that selection. And later on, we'll kind of elaborate some of these points with some examples from relevant industries. Thanks, everyone.
Hi there. Actually, I think it's going to be me, Paul, for this section.
Okay, great.
So thank you very much. That was very, very good detail there, and I'm glad that we've included a couple of slides there for future reference on pros and cons. And the reason being is that there's an awful lot of choices there. Some of them will be driven by industry and commodity because there will be certain standards and or approaches to pricing that are standard in a given industry. But where you have choices, there's actually quite a few of them, and the pros and cons are really what you need to focus on. So for those of you who are going to go forward and use some of the things that we're talking about, those two slides where we get into the pros and cons that are what we're sort of providing the leave behind for you there, that we think will be quite helpful. So moving on to sort of starting to put some of these choices together. We've talked about the project delivery models. We've talked about the compensation or remuneration models, depending on how you want to call them. One thing I want to emphasize is that those things themselves are components of your contract strategy. So sometimes people will use, oh, my strategy is to do a lump sum. They'll say that, and really that's actually just a compensation model that presumes some sort of delivery model. So it only really tells part of the story. So we want to talk about next here is selecting amongst these options. If you could advance the slide, Stephen, that would be great. Okay, so there's a lot of ways to pictorialize this, and so we've chosen this one or a couple of slides, but so some of it at the beginning is you sort of start off big and then you sort of go down into your specific choices, and so obviously the word context denotes this bigger space, and so the type of project you're engaged in or typically engage in this case is a big part of your context. So previously in one of the earlier slides, we talked about how there's an external environment and an internal environment, and these two things are implied here. So the project type might be more of an internal characteristic, and then where you look in the next column where you'll see market intel, that's more of an external characteristic. So we're still following that earlier design approach that had internal and external sort of coming together and becoming factors. And then you had the cloud with the various arrows going into it that that Keith reviewed, where you had a number of factors. So we're looking at those again, but now we're starting to look at it a bit more in a procedural way. One thing that we haven't talked about that much up until now is this idea of doing a risk assessment. And a risk assessment is a significant component of any contracting strategy, in particular for what we would call a higher risk or higher complexity type of project, which is often measured by the number of interfaces within that particular project. So the more, sort of the typical thing is that the interfaces is n with an exponent. So the idea being that the more interfaces you have, the more their complexity tends to increase exponentially, like this. And so the idea is here that it is a good practice to conduct a risk assessment that considers your context. And the risk assessment, and there's many ways to do this. There's an ISO standard on risk assessment. And typically it would start off with some kind of a brainstorming session where you would complete a risk register. And then within that risk register, once it's established, there would be mitigations after you've estimated, I suppose, what the risks are and the quantity or the value of those risks. Then you would have some sort of mitigations. Some organizations are lucky in the sense is that they have the resources to measure risk accurately. One of the more accurate forms of risk management or risk management is a Monte Carlo or simulation or similar simulation capability that allows you to, sort of quantify this. Whereas if you don't have that, then you're kind of relying a lot more on experience and judgment, really. So to that extent, that's where the long number of years in a particular industry or with particular project types can be helpful. So then moving on into this area of experience, this is sort of more of external in the sense that after you've established what you believe your context is and what the level of risk is that you're for which you may have an appetite, hopefully, then you might consider the experiences that you've had with these kinds of projects before. If it's a new project or a new kind of context in which the project is being delivered, then obviously the risk is higher, and that's going to influence your strategy. But certainly, and this goes back to, I think one of Keith's arrows said something about lessons learned, if I recall properly. This is sort of where your lessons learned and the discipline around lessons learned from a project management perspective can become quite helpful, because it injects the knowledge about risk and experience, which frankly, in a project context, can dissipate after the project is closed and people move on, and they're in other projects, or they move on from an organization altogether. So if you have a healthy way of recording lessons learned, and how those lessons learned then feed into, so that's another step, how those lessons learned feed into a contracting strategy, that will improve greatly your knowledge about your recent experiences, or at least maintain your knowledge about recent experiences beyond that which can be remembered. And then combined with the market intelligence. And so the market in particular, I think in this last year, or maybe even 18 months, has been extremely volatile. And so having, again, a capability to be able to understand what's going on in the market is key. And some organizations are lucky in that they sense is they might have some kind of a market intelligence type function, or they have a third party that they engage to provide market intelligence. Common things are, commodity prices, for example, would be a common thing to have market intelligence about. And so this whole idea of supply and demand and the impact on price. There's a lot of talk about how labor and certain inputs now, lumber, copper, things like that are construction inputs, might go up in price quite a bit as the market tends to reopen post-COVID. So these are the types of things that are part of your market intelligence, and these again will inform your choices as to what kind of contract strategy. So the first component of the contract strategy here, it's called contractual construct. That can also be referred to as a project delivery model as well, and Keith went over those in detail, and those are typically matched with a compensation model. So you would take a significant component of your strategy would be this delivery model plus your compensation model, and then how you're going to divide up the scope. And the how is not just to whom, but also the procurement routes and negotiation approaches that you're going to take. I wanted to clarify one thing here right now is that contracting strategy and negotiation strategy are not the same thing. You are negotiating to achieve or to realize a particular contracting strategy, but typically if someone says I have a strategy and it's a strategy for negotiations, that's good, but it's not the same as a contracting strategy. And so this is where a knowledge and interface with the procurement function is necessary and helpful. And in some cases, you may have policies and procedures that actually constrain your choices. In particular, if you're in the public sector, and we're going to address that in one of the contract quote discussions in public infrastructure acquisition. But the idea here is that the procurement route is part of this choice or part of this assignment strategy. So your choices are the project delivery plus the compensation model plus how you're going to take that to market and engage a supplier. So that's what comes down into your method for selection. So you may have a number of these combos. So you might have a number of context, experience, and then choices, a number of choices of project model, comp model, and your strategy for taking it to market. If you could advance the slide, please, Stephen. Here we go. Okay, so and this is the choices that I'm referring to. And again, we have a work breakdown. We're using WBS here, work breakdown structure. You can sometimes referred to as a scope split, but it's basically how you're dividing the scope out, and it will take the form of a quilt, and you'll understand that terminology if you don't already, when you see what a quilt looks like, which we'll show you. But the idea here is that amongst your choices or combo choices, as I mentioned before, project delivery method, compensation model, and assignment strategy, you might have one that accumulates to option A, another that accumulates to option B, and another that accumulates to option C, and then you would evaluate them, much in the same way that you would evaluate a supplier submission, for example. You would have some kind of criteria. Some of the criteria that you'll see here in the arrows, and you'll have some sort of criteria, and then you would essentially use those criteria to choose. And I've seen methods where you're essentially scoring them, and you're assigning a certain score for each option and how it treats a given input. And the one essentially with the highest score becomes your preferred approach to contracting, and that will imply a certain work breakdown structure or how the scope is split and how that scope is compensated amongst your various market actors, contractors, suppliers, and so on. So that's the approach of choosing. Okay, that's the approach of choosing And we will now provide some examples of how those choices have been made. Not that easy to convey perfectly without experiencing it, but this is how we're going to do our best through these examples. Steve, if you could advance the slide. I believe Keith is now going to delve into where advanced work packaging interfaces with some of these contracting choices. And with that, I will hand it over. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about advanced work packaging. Can you move to the next slide, please?